The morning sun was barely peeking through the skyscrapers of Manhattan when Richard Maxwell stepped out of his penthouse apartment. At 55, he had everything money could buy: expensive suits, a fleet of luxury cars, and more houses than he could count. But today something felt different. Maybe it was because he was carrying $100,000 in cash in his designer briefcase, or maybe it was the strange dream he had last night about his late wife, Margaret. Richard checked his Rolex watch and hurried toward his waiting limousine. The money was for a real estate deal he had to close before noon. Old school as he was, he preferred cash transactions. They reminded him of how he started his business 30 years ago, selling used cars in the Bronx. "Good morning, Mr. Maxwell," his driver Thomas said with a smile. Thomas had been working for him for 15 years, one of the few people Richard truly trusted. "Morning, Thomas. First stop is the coffee shop on 5th Avenue. I need my usual." The limousine merged into the morning traffic, and Richard's mind wandered to the meeting ahead. The property he was buying would complete his collection of premium Manhattan real estate. He patted the briefcase next to him, feeling satisfied. At the coffee shop, Richard got out, leaving the briefcase on the seat. "I'll be right back, Thomas. Just need my morning fix." But when Richard returned 5 minutes later with his large black coffee, his world turned upside down. The briefcase was gone. "Thomas, where's my briefcase?" Richard's voice boomed through the car. Thomas looked confused. "Sir, I didn't see anyone approach the car. I was watching the whole time." Richard's hand started shaking. $100,000 gone. He grabbed his phone to call the police, but then stopped. How would it look if the press got wind of this? Richard Maxwell, billionaire real estate mogul, carelessly loses briefcase full of cash. His competitors would have a field day. "Drive around the block, Thomas, now," Richard ordered, his face red with anger and worry. As they circled the area, Richard spotted something that made his heart stop. There, on a bench near Central Park, sat a woman in worn-out clothes, his briefcase at her feet. She was black, probably in her 40s, and her clothes suggested she was homeless. But what struck Richard most was how calmly she sat there, as if waiting for something or someone. "Stop the car!" Richard jumped out before Thomas could fully brake. He stormed toward the woman, ready to demand his briefcase back, maybe even call the police. But as he got closer, something in her eyes made him slow down. She looked up at him with a gentle smile. "Mr. Maxwell, I believe this belongs to you." She gestured to the briefcase. Richard stopped in his tracks. "How do you know? My name?" "Everyone knows Richard Maxwell in this city," she said, her voice surprisingly refined for someone living on the streets. "I'm Grace Williams. And before you ask, yes, I looked inside the briefcase. $100,000 is a lot, though of money to leave unattended." Richard felt a mix of embarrassment and anger. "So why didn't you take it? That kind of money could change your life." Grace's smile faded slightly. "Money isn't everything, Mr. Maxwell. I may not have a home, but I have something more valuable: integrity. My mama taught me that before she passed." Richard stood there speechless. In his world of hostile takeovers and million-dollar deals, integrity was a rare commodity. "However," Grace continued, "I do want something from you." Richard's businessman instincts kicked in. "Name your price, 10% of what's in there." Grace shook her head. "I don't want your money, Mr. Maxwell. I want a job." "A job?" Richard couldn't hide his surprise. "Yes, I have a master's degree in business administration from Columbia University. Life just took some unexpected turns after my husband died and the medical bills piled up. I've been trying to get back on my feet, but nobody wants to hire someone without a fixed address." Richard studied her more carefully now. Behind the worn clothes and tired eyes, he could see something familiar, the same determination he had when he was starting out, sleeping in his car while trying to build his business. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, but his tone had softened. "You're holding a briefcase with $100,000 that I could have walked away with. Instead, I'm sitting here waiting to return it to its rightful owner. I'd say that's a pretty good start for trust." For the first time that morning, Richard smiled. He reached for his briefcase, but instead of taking it and walking away, he sat down next to Grace on the bench. Tell me more about yourself, Grace, and what exactly would you like to do in my company? As Grace began to speak, neither of them noticed Thomas watching from the limousine with a knowing smile, nor the morning sun rising higher over Manhattan, casting a golden glow over the unlikely pair on the park bench. It was the beginning of a story that would change not just their lives, but the lives of everyone around them. In his penthouse that evening, Richard sat in his leather armchair, holding a glass of scotch. The real estate deal had been postponed, but he didn't care. His mind kept going back to Grace and their conversation. He had offered her a position as his personal assistant, starting tomorrow. It was a risk, he knew, but something in his gut told him it was the right decision. He walked to his window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Grace was probably still trying to process how her life had changed in one day. Richard smiled, remembering how she had insisted on getting everything in writing, showing a business acumen that impressed him. "What would you think about this, Margaret?" he whispered to his late wife's picture on the mantel. The photograph showed a beautiful black woman with a kind smile, not unlike Grace's. Richard and Margaret's marriage had scandalized New York society 20 years ago, but they never cared. She had been his rock until cancer took her 5 years ago. His phone buzzed with a message from his son, James. "Dad, heard you hired a homeless woman as your PA. Have you lost your mind? We need to talk." Richard put the phone away without responding. James, like everyone else, would have to accept his decision. Besides, he had a feeling that Grace Williams was going to surprise them all. Grace arrived at Maxwell Enterprises exactly at 7:30 a.m. the next morning. She wore a simple black dress she had bought from a thrift store with the money Richard had given her as an advance. Her hair was neatly pulled back, and she carried a worn leather bag containing her few possessions, including her precious MBA diploma. The security guard at the front desk looked her up and down suspiciously. "Can I help you?" "I'm Grace Williams. Mr. Maxwell is expecting me." The guard was about to say something when Richard's voice boomed from across the lobby. "Grace, right on time." He walked over wearing one of his expensive suits and handed her an ID badge. "This is your security pass. You'll need it to access all areas of the building." The guard's eyes widened, and he quickly straightened up in his chair. Everyone in the building knew that Richard Maxwell didn't personally greet new employees, let alone escort them to their offices. As they rode the elevator to the top floor, Grace could feel her heart pounding. Just yesterday, she had been sitting on a park bench wondering where her next meal would come from. Now she was heading to an office in one of New York's most prestigious buildings. "Your office is right next to mine," Richard explained, as they stepped out of the elevator. "I need my personal assistant close by." The office was bigger than the motel room where Grace had been staying whenever she could afford it. A sleek computer sat on a modern desk, and the wall-to-wall windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park. "Mr. Maxwell, this is..." Grace started, but Richard cut her off. "Please call me Richard, and before you say anything else, there's someone I'd like you to meet." A young man burst into the office without knocking. He was in his early 30s, wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than what Grace used to make in a year at her last job. "Dad, we need to talk about this right now." He stopped short when he saw Grace. "Oh, so it's true. You really did it." "Grace, this is my son, James," Richard said calmly. "James, this is Grace Williams, my new personal assistant. She has an MBA from Columbia." James barely nodded at Grace before turning back to his father. "Can we speak privately?" "Anything you need to say, you can say in front of Grace. She's part of the team now." James's face reddened. "Fine, the board members are worried. Hiring a..." He glanced at Grace. "Someone off the street? What were you thinking? We have a reputation to maintain." "I was thinking that I found someone with integrity, intelligence, and experience who deserves a second chance," Richard replied firmly. "Just like I got my second chance 30 years ago. That was different. You weren't..." "Wasn't what, James?" Richard's voice had an edge to it. "Wasn't homeless? Because I was. For 6 months I lived in my car while trying to start my business. Or were you going to say something else?" Grace stood quietly, feeling the tension between father and son. She noticed how James's expensive watch trembled slightly as he clenched his fists. "The board meeting is in an hour," James finally said. "I hope you know what you're doing." He stormed out, leaving the door open behind him. Richard sighed and turned to Grace. "I apologize for my son. He's had everything handed to him his whole life. Sometimes I wonder if I did him a disservice by making things too easy." "No need to apologize," Grace said. "I understand his concern. It's not every day someone goes from a park bench to an executive office." Richard smiled. "Well, let's prove them all wrong, shall we? First order of business. The Thompson deal files need to be organized for the board meeting. Think you can handle it?" Grace was already sitting at her computer. "Those would be the files about the downtown development project, right? I read about it in the business journal last month. The zoning issues might be a problem, but I have some ideas about that." Richard raised his eyebrows, impressed. Even living on the streets, she had kept up with business news. Maybe his gut feeling about her was even more right than he thought. As Grace worked on organizing the files, she couldn't help but notice the family photos on Richard's desk through the glass wall separating their offices. She saw pictures of a younger Richard with a beautiful black woman, his late wife, she assumed. Something about those photos made her feel less out of place. The morning flew by as Grace immersed herself in work. She had forgotten how much she loved the challenge of business problems. Around noon, Richard's secretary, Linda, stopped by her office. "Here's your new phone and tablet," Linda said, placing them on Grace's desk. Her tone was professional but cool. "Mr. Maxwell asked me to help you set up your email and show you around." "Thank you, Linda. I appreciate your help." Linda paused at the door. "Just so you know, I've been working here for 20 years. Mr. Maxwell is a good man, but he can be too trusting sometimes. Don't take advantage of that." Before Grace could respond, Linda was gone. It was clear that winning over the staff would be as challenging as proving herself to the board. During the board meeting, Grace sat quietly taking notes while Richard presented the Thompson deal. She noticed how James kept glancing at her suspiciously, and how some board members among themselves when they thought no one was looking. But Grace didn't mind. She had faced worse challenges in her life. As she listened to the discussion about property values and investment returns, her mind was already working on solutions to the zoning issues she had noticed earlier. After the meeting, Richard called her into his office. "You seemed deep in thought during the presentation. Care to share?" Grace hesitated for a moment, then straightened her shoulders. "Actually, I noticed something about the zoning regulations that might help with the Thompson deal. Would you like to hear about it?" Richard leaned back in his chair and smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Tell me everything." As Grace began explaining her ideas, she felt a familiar excitement building inside her. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again. Not a homeless woman, not a charity case, but a businesswoman with something valuable to contribute. Neither of them noticed James watching through the glass wall, his expression dark with concern and something else, fear. Fear that this woman might be more than just another one of his father's charitable projects. Fear that she might actually be good at her job. After 2 weeks at Maxwell Enterprises, Grace had settled into a routine. She arrived early each morning, often before Richard himself, and stayed late reviewing contracts and business proposals. The small motel room she now called home wasn't much, but it was better than the streets, and she was saving every penny she could. One morning, while Grace was reviewing some documents, Linda rushed into her office. "Mr. Maxwell's wife is here." "Wife?" Grace looked confused. "But I thought Mrs. Maxwell had passed away." "His new wife," Linda said with a hint of distaste. "Victoria. They got married 6 months ago. She usually doesn't come to the office, but when she does..." Linda made a face that said everything. Before Grace could ask more, a tall blonde woman in her early 40s swept into the office. She wore a red designer dress and jewelry that probably cost more than Grace's yearly salary. "So, you're the homeless woman Richard hired," Victoria said, looking Grace up and down. "How so charitable of my husband." Grace stood up, maintaining her composure. "I'm Grace Williams, Mr. Maxwell's personal assistant. How can I help you?" Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "I need to see my husband. Is he in?" "He's in a meeting with the Thompson development team right now, but I can let him know you're here as soon as he's finished." Victoria's perfectly made-up face darkened. "Listen, I don't think you understand how things work here. I'm Mrs. Maxwell. I don't wait." Just then, Richard emerged from his office with several executives. His face showed surprise when he saw his wife. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" "Darling, can't a wife visit her husband at work?" Victoria's voice had suddenly turned sweet. She walked over and kissed Richard's cheek, leaving a red lipstick mark. The executives quickly excused themselves, and Victoria followed Richard into his office. Grace couldn't help but notice how Victoria deliberately closed the blinds between their offices. Through the door, Grace could hear raised voices. She tried to focus on her work, but fragments of the conversation reached her ears. $20,000 for a handbag. "Victoria, we talked about this. You can't tell me how to spend my money. This marriage contract gives me... It's not about the money. It's about responsibility." Grace felt uncomfortable listening to their private argument. She gathered some files and headed to the break room to give them privacy. There she found James getting coffee. "Stepmom's here," he said, not looking at Grace. "Dad's second biggest mistake in the past year." It was the first time James had spoken directly to Grace since her first day. "You don't approve of the marriage?" she asked carefully. James snorted. "Victoria worked in the marketing department. Within a month of Mum's death, she had her claws in Dad. He was vulnerable, lonely. She saw her chance and took it. Your father seems like a smart man. He must see something in her. What he sees is someone who reminds him of being young. Victoria's good at that, making men feel young and important." James poured cream in his coffee, his hands shaking slightly. "But what he doesn't see is how she's changing everything Mom built here." Grace was surprised by James's openness. Maybe it was because he needed someone to talk to, or maybe he'd finally started seeing her as more than just a homeless woman his father had hired. "Your mother, she was involved in the business?" James's face softened. "Mum was Dad's partner in everything. She started the company's charitable foundation, made sure we gave back to the community. She believed wealth came with responsibility." He looked at Grace. "That's probably why Dad hired you. You remind him of her." Before Grace could respond, they heard Victoria's voice getting louder. She stormed out of Richard's office and past the break room, her high heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. James sighed. "Back to work. Those contracts won't review themselves." He hesitated at the door. "You're doing a good job with the Thompson deal, by the way, but don't let it go to your head." Grace returned to her office to find Richard standing by her desk, looking tired. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Victoria wants to renovate the entire penthouse again, says she needs more closet space for her shopping." He sat down in one of her visitor chairs. "Sometimes I wonder if you made a mistake." Grace finished, quietly. Richard looked at her sharply, then his face softened. "You're very perceptive, Grace. Yes. Sometimes I wonder. Margaret, my late wife, she was different. She understood what we were trying to build here. James told me about her foundation. The work, did he now?" Richard smiled slightly. "He's warming up to you, it seems. Margaret would have liked you, you know. She believed in giving people chances." He stood up, straightening his tie. "Speaking of chances, how are you doing with the zoning proposal for the Thompson deal?" Grace pulled up some documents on her computer. "I think I found a solution. If we include a community center in the development plan," as they discussed business, Grace couldn't help but notice how Richard seemed to relax, the tension from his argument with Victoria fading away. She understood now why he had hired her, not just because she had returned his money, but because she represented something he had lost, someone who cared about more than just wealth and status. Later that day, Grace was working late when Victoria returned to the office. Richard had already left for a dinner meeting. "I know what you're doing," Victoria said, standing in Grace's doorway, playing the humble, hard-working angle. "But let me tell you something. I worked hard to get where I am, and I won't let some charity case ruin everything." Grace met Victoria's gaze steadily. "Mrs. Maxwell, I'm just here to do my job." "We'll see about that." Victoria's smile was cold. "Everyone has secrets, Grace Williams. I wonder what we'd find if we dug deep enough into your past." After Victoria left, Grace sat in her office for a long time, her hands trembling slightly. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph, a young woman in a cap and gown at her Columbia graduation. standing next to a handsome man in a military uniform. Her late husband, Michael. There were indeed secrets in her past, things she hadn't told Richard. But they weren't what Victoria might think. The question was, would those secrets destroy the new life she was building, or would they make Richard understand her even more? Victoria's threat about digging into Grace's past had hit home harder than she wanted to admit. That night in her small motel room, Grace couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Michael, about the choices she'd made, and about the real reason she'd ended up on the streets. The next morning, Grace arrived at the office earlier than usual. She was surprised to find James already there, sitting in her office. "We need to talk," he said, holding a manila folder. "I had someone look into your background." Grace's heart stopped for a moment. "I see. And what did you find?" "Your husband, Michael Williams. He was a Marine, died in Afghanistan 8 years ago." James opened the folder. "But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what happened after his death." Grace sat down heavily in her chair. "James, please, you were the whistleblower," he continued. "You exposed a massive insurance fraud scheme at Veterans United Healthcare, where you worked as a financial analyst. The company was denying benefits to veterans' families while pocketing millions." He looked up at her. "They destroyed you for it, didn't they?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "They made sure I would never work in finance again. Every time I got a job, mysterious complaints would appear. My savings went to lawyers and Michael's medical bills. Eventually, I had nothing left." James was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell Dad about this?" "Because I didn't want him to hire me out of pity. Or worse, worry that I might cause trouble for his company." Grace wiped her eyes. "Your father gave me a chance based on who I am now, not my past. Well, your past is about to catch up with you." James handed her a newspaper. "Victoria's brother just joined the board of Veterans United Healthcare. Once she finds out who you really are, she'll try to force me out," Grace finished, "to protect their corporate connections." James stood up. "I don't like you very much, Grace, but what you did for those veterans' families, that took courage, the kind of courage my mother would have admired." He walked to the door, then turned back. "I'll stall Victoria's investigation as long as I can, but you need to tell Dad the truth before she does." Grace spent the morning distracted trying to figure out how to tell Richard, but the day was packed with meetings about the Thompson deal, which was reaching a critical phase. Around lunchtime, Richard poked his head into her office. "Grace, can you join me for lunch? There's something I want to discuss." They went to a small Italian restaurant around the corner, one of Richard's favorites. After they ordered, he pulled out some papers. "I want you to look at something," he said. "It's a proposal to restart Margaret's charitable foundation. I think it's time we got back to doing some real good in the community." Grace looked at the papers, her guilt growing. "Richard, there's something I need to tell you." "Mr. Maxwell, what a surprise." Victoria's voice cut through the restaurant. She walked up to their table, her brother David beside her. "Having a business lunch?" Richard looked annoyed at the interruption. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" "David and I were just discussing some interesting information about your new assistant." Victoria's smile was predatory. "Did you know she used to work for Veterans United Healthcare?" Grace saw Richard's expression change. "Grace? She was more than just an employee," David added. "She was the whistleblower who nearly brought down the company, cost them millions in settlements and bad publicity." "Is this true?" Richard asked quietly. Grace took a deep breath. "Yes. I exposed their fraud because they were denying benefits to veterans' families. Families like mine. My husband died serving this country, and they tried to cheat us out of his benefits." "She's a troublemaker, Richard," Victoria said. "She'll do the same thing to your company if you give her the chance." Richard was silent for a long moment. The whole restaurant seemed to hold its breath. "You're right, Victoria," he finally said. "Grace is a troublemaker." He stood up. "Just like I was 30 years ago when I exposed price fixing in the auto industry. Just like Margaret was when she fought against discriminatory lending practices." He turned to David. "Veterans United Healthcare stole from heroes and their families. If you're defending them, maybe we need to reconsider our business relationships." Victoria's face turned red. "Richard, you can't be serious. Think about the connections we'll lose." "I am thinking about them. I'm thinking it's time Maxwell Enterprises went back to its roots, standing up for what's right, not just what's profitable. He looked at Grace. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? I was afraid, Grace admitted. Afraid you'd think I was too risky to have around. Richard laughed. Risky? Grace, you're exactly what this company needs. He turned to Victoria and David. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a foundation to rebuild. Victoria stormed out, her brother following behind. As they left, Grace saw James standing near the restaurant entrance. He gave her a small nod before disappearing into the crowd. Back at the office, Richard called an emergency board meeting. He announced his plan to restart Margaret's foundation, with Grace as its director, while maintaining her role as his assistant. 8 years ago, Grace Williams sacrificed everything to stand up for what was right, he told the board. Today, we have the chance to show that integrity and profit can go hand in hand. That evening, as Grace packed up her things, she found a note on her desk. In James's handwriting, it said, "Mum would be proud. Maybe I was wrong about you." She smiled, thinking about how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. From a park bench to a corner office, from hiding her past to embracing it. But more than that, she had found something she thought she'd lost forever, a purpose and people who understood what really mattered. In his office, Richard looked at Margaret's picture. "You'd like her, honey," he whispered. "She reminds me of you, never afraid to fight for what's right." Outside, the city lights began to twinkle as another day came to an end at Maxwell Enterprises. But for Grace, it felt more like a beginning. She had found not just a job, but a mission, and maybe, just maybe, a family. The news about Grace's past spread through Maxwell Enterprises like wildfire. Some employees saw her as a hero, while others whispered that she would bring trouble to the company. But Grace kept her head high and focused on her work, especially the new foundation project. One morning, a week after the restaurant confrontation, Linda rushed into Grace's office. "You need to see this," she said, handing Grace a tablet with the morning's business news pulled up. The headline made Grace's blood run cold. Maxwell Enterprises stock drops as major investors question new direction. Victoria's brother has been busy, Linda explained. He's been telling investors that Richard is letting emotions cloud his judgment, that the company is becoming too focused on charity instead of profits. Grace felt her stomach twist. She had faced this before at Veterans United, the way powerful people could manipulate the system to protect their interests. Richard walked in, looking more determined than worried. "I suppose you've seen the news." "Richard, I'm so sorry. Maybe we should delay the foundation launch." "Absolutely not," Richard cut her off. "I didn't build this company by running from bullies. We're going ahead as planned." He paused. "But we need to move fast. The Thompson deal has to close this week and the foundation announcement needs to happen right after. Show them we can do both, make money and do good." James appeared in the doorway. "Dad, the Thompson family is here. They want to meet with you privately." Richard straightened his tie. "Grace, come with me. You've done most of the work on this deal anyway." In the conference room, elderly Robert Thompson sat with his daughter Sarah. They were old money, the kind that could make or break reputations in New York society. "Richard," Robert said gravely, "we've known each other for 30 years, so I'm going to be direct. There are rumors that Maxwell Enterprises is becoming unstable. Victoria's brother reached out to us." "Of course he did," Richard muttered. "We're concerned," Sarah added. "This deal represents a significant investment for us." Grace spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, if I may." At Richard's nod, she opened her laptop. "The community center we've included in the development plan isn't just charity, it's smart business. By providing services and programs for local residents, we'll increase property values in the entire area. Our projections show a 15% higher return on investment over 5 years compared to the original plan." She pulled up more slides, showing detailed financial analyses. "Plus, the goodwill generated will make future developments in the area much easier to approve. We're not just building buildings, we're building relationships." Robert Thompson leaned forward, interested. "You've done your homework, young lady. Richard, where did you find her?" "On a park bench in Central Park," Richard said proudly. "Where?" She was sitting with a briefcase containing $100,000 of my money, waiting to return it. Robert's eyebrows shot up. The homeless woman who returned your money? That story was all over the papers, but they never mentioned... He looked at Grace with new respect. That I'm black, Grace said calmly, or that I was a whistleblower who lost everything fighting for what's right. The papers don't always tell the whole story, Mr. Thompson. No, Robert smiled. They certainly don't. He turned to Richard. The deal stands. In fact, we'd like to increase our investment. If this is the kind of thinking you're bringing to Maxwell Enterprises, we want to be part of it. After the Thompsons left, James lingered in the conference room. That was impressive, he admitted to Grace. Mom used to say that doing good was good business. I guess she was right. Your mother was a smart woman, Grace said. I wish I could have met her. Yeah, James said softly. Me too. He hesitated. Listen, Victoria's planning something. I overheard her on the phone with her brother. They're not going to stop just because we won over the Thompsons. I know, Grace sighed. People like that never do. That evening, Grace finally moved out of the motel. Richard had insisted on helping her find a small apartment, saying it was part of her compensation package. As she unpacked her few belongings, she found the old photo of her and Michael at her graduation. I'm still fighting, honey, she whispered to his image, just in a different way now. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Board meeting. Tomorrow. Victoria and David want to call a vote of no confidence. Be ready. Grace sat down on her new bed, thinking. She had been in battles like this before. Last time she had lost everything. But this time was different. This time she wasn't alone. She called Linda at home, something she had never done before. Linda, I need a favor. Can you pull all the records of Victoria's expenses since she married Richard? And I mean everything. Already did, Linda replied, surprising Grace. I've been keeping track since day one. That woman's been bleeding the company dry with her lifestyle expenses. I just didn't have anyone to tell before. Grace smiled. Linda, who had been so cold to her at first, was now an ally. Send me everything. And Linda, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Linda said. Just promise me one thing. When you take her down, make it count. After hanging up, Grace opened her laptop and began to work. The sun had long set and the city lights twinkled outside her new apartment window. Tomorrow would be a battle, but tonight she had work to do. Victoria thought she knew everything about Grace's past, but she had forgotten one important detail. Before Grace became a whistleblower, she had been a financial analyst, and she was very, very good at following the money. In his penthouse, Richard sat in his study looking at the company's stock price chart. The recent drop didn't worry him as much as it should, maybe because for the first time in years, he felt like the company was heading in the right direction. His phone buzzed with a message from James. You were right about Grace, I was wrong. What's the plan for tomorrow? Richard smiled. His son was finally seeing what he had seen that day in the park, that sometimes the most valuable things in life come in unexpected packages. He replied, the plan is to let Grace do what she does best, fight for what's right. The morning of the board meeting, Grace arrived at the office 2 hours early. She had spent most of the night reviewing the documents Linda had sent her, and what she found made her understand why Victoria was fighting so hard to maintain her position. You're here early, James said, walking into her office with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. Couldn't sleep either. Thanks, Grace said, taking the coffee. I found something in Victoria's expenses, something big. James sat down. How big? $2 million big, Grace said, turning her computer screen toward him. All hidden in renovation expenses for the penthouse, but the money didn't go to any contractors. It went to offshore accounts. James leaned forward, studying the screen. She's been stealing from the company? Not exactly stealing. The expenses were approved by her brother David when he was briefly on the finance committee. But there's more. Grace pulled up another document. These accounts, they're connected to Veterans United Healthcare. Victoria's been helping them hide money, using Maxwell Enterprises as a cover. Does Dad know? Not yet. I wanted to be sure before I told him. The door opened and Richard walked in, looking tired but determined. Told me what? Grace and James exchanged looks. "You better sit down, Dad," James said. As Grace explained what she had found, Richard's face grew darker. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. 2 years, he finally said. 2 years of mourning Margaret, feeling lost, and Victoria saw an opportunity, not just for marriage, but for a business arrangement. He looked at Grace. "No wonder she wanted you gone. You're too good at following the money." "The board meeting starts in an hour," James reminded them. "Victoria and David will be ready for a fight." "Good," Richard said grimly. "So will we." The boardroom filled quickly. Victoria sat near the head of the table, wearing an expensive red suit and a confident smile. Her brother David sat beside her, scrolling through his phone. Other board members filed in, many looking uncomfortable. Richard took his place at the head of the table, with Grace and James on either side of him. Linda stood by the door, ready with additional documents if needed. "Before we begin," Victoria said smoothly, "I move to have Grace Williams removed from this meeting. She's not a board member." "She stays," Richard said firmly. "As my personal assistant and the new foundation director, she has every right to be here." Victoria's smile tightened. "Fine, then let's get to the point. This company is losing its way. The stock price is dropping, investors are nervous, all because you're letting personal feelings cloud your judgment." She looked around the table. "I move for a vote of no confidence in Richard Maxwell's leadership." "Seconded," David added quickly. "Before we vote," Grace spoke up, her voice clear and strong, "the board should review these documents." She nodded to Linda, who began distributing folders. Victoria's face paled slightly. "What is this?" "A complete audit of your expenses over the past year," Grace said, "including the $2 million that mysteriously disappeared into offshore. Accounts connected to Veterans United Healthcare." The boardroom erupted in murmurs. David jumped to his feet. "This is ridiculous." "You can't just make accusations." "Oh, sit down, David," Richard commanded. "The documents have already been verified by our accounting firm. Would you like to explain to the board why you approved these transfers when you were on the finance committee?" Victoria's composure cracked. "You don't understand. Veterans United was going to merge with Maxwell Healthcare. It would have doubled the company's medical division. By partnering with a company that cheats veterans' families." Grace stood up. "I lost everything fighting them once. I won't let them take this company too." "You?" Victoria laughed desperately. "You're nothing but a homeless woman my husband picked up off the street." "No," James cut in, surprising everyone. "She's the kind of person this company was built on. Someone who believes in doing what's right, no matter the cost." He looked at his father. "The kind of person Mom was." Richard smiled at his son, then turned to the board. "The vote today isn't about no confidence in my leadership. It's about who we are as a company. Margaret built this foundation on integrity. I lost sight of that after she died, but thanks to Grace I found it again." He took out a document of his own. "This is my proposal. Victoria's position in the company will be terminated, and all suspicious transfers will be investigated. The foundation will be relaunched, focusing on veterans' families and corporate responsibility. And Grace Williams will continue in her role, helping us build a company we can all be proud of." "You can't do this." Victoria stood up, her face red. "I'm your wife." "Actually," Richard said calmly, "as of this morning, you're not. My lawyers filed for divorce first thing today. The prenup is very clear about financial misconduct." Victoria grabbed her designer bag and stormed toward the door, her brother following close behind. At the last moment, she turned back. "You'll regret this, all of you." After they left, the board voted unanimously to support Richard's proposal. As people filed out of the boardroom, many stopped to shake Grace's hand or pat her shoulder. James lingered behind. "That was something else," he said to Grace. "For what it's worth, I'm glad Dad found you in the park that day." Grace smiled. "Me too." Later that evening, Grace sat in her new apartment, watching the sunset over the city. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Dinner tomorrow? There's someone I want you to meet." "Who?" she texted back. "My sister, Rebecca. She's flying in from California, says she wants to meet the woman who helped save the family company." Grace smiled. A month ago, she had been sleeping on park benches. Now she had a home, a purpose, and people who believed in her. More than that, she had helped protect something important, a company that could do real good in the world. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Linda. News about Victoria's resignation just hit the press. Stock price is already going up. Grace walked to her window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Victoria and David were probably plotting their revenge, but she wasn't worried. She had faced worse odds before and survived. Besides, this time she wasn't fighting alone. On her bedside table, the photo of Michael seemed to smile at her in the fading light. "We did it, honey," she whispered. "We did it." The morning sun streamed through the windows of Maxwell Enterprises. As Grace prepared for another busy day, 3 weeks had passed since Victoria's dramatic exit, and things were finally starting to settle down. The company's stock price had recovered, and the new foundation was taking shape. "Grace?" Linda poked her head in. "Richard's sister Rebecca is here." Grace looked up to see a woman who could have been Margaret Maxwell's twin sister. Rebecca had the same warm brown skin and kind eyes that Grace had seen in the photos on Richard's desk. "So you're the famous Grace Williams," Rebecca said, walking into the office. "The whole family's been talking about you." "All good things, I hope," Grace replied, standing to shake her hand. "More than good. You saved my brother from making the biggest mistake of his life." Rebecca sat down. "But that's not why I'm here. I need your help." Before Rebecca could explain, Richard appeared in the doorway. "Becca, I see you've met Grace." He hugged his sister. "Are you ready for dinner tonight?" "Actually," Rebecca said, "I was hoping to borrow Grace for lunch. Sister-in-law stuff." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Sister-in-law?" "Figure of speech," Rebecca said quickly, but Grace noticed how Richard's face had flushed slightly. After Richard left, Rebecca turned to Grace. "Sorry about that. Sometimes I forget how much you remind everyone of Margaret, especially Richard." "It's fine," Grace said, though her heart was beating a little faster. "What did you want to discuss?" Rebecca's face turned serious. "Victoria's brother, David? He just joined the board of my hospital in California. And strange things have started happening. Missing medications, unexplained equipment failures, incorrect patient bills. They're trying to sabotage you to get back at Richard," Grace realized. "Yes, but it's worse than that. We're the largest veterans healthcare provider on the West Coast. If they can take control, they can continue what Veterans United was doing," Grace finished, "denying care to veterans while pocketing the money." "Exactly. I need your help to stop them." Rebecca leaned forward. "You've beaten them before. You can do it again." Grace thought about all the families she had tried to help at Veterans United, about Michael, and how he had died waiting for treatment that was delayed by bureaucratic errors. "I'll help," she said, "but we need to be smart about this. Victoria and David are probably waiting for us to make a move." "Thank you." Rebecca squeezed her hand. "Now about dinner tonight. Don't worry, I won't mention any of this to Richard yet." Rebecca smiled. "That's not what I was going to say. I was going to warn you about Richard. The way he looks at you. I haven't seen him look at anyone like that since Margaret." Grace felt her face grow warm. "We're just colleagues. Honey, I've known my brother for 50 years. He's falling for you, and from what I can see, you might be falling for him too." Before Grace could respond, James burst into the office. "Grace, we have a problem. Someone leaked Victoria's expense reports to the press, but they've been altered. They're making it look like you and Dad conspired to frame her." Grace grabbed her tablet, pulling up the morning's news. The headlines made her stomach turn. Maxwell Enterprises scandal. Did CEO and former homeless woman conspire to oust his wife? "Victoria's fingerprints are all over this," Rebecca said grimly. "But why?" Now Grace wondered. Then it hit her. "The Thompson deal closes tomorrow. If they can create enough scandal, the whole deal could fall apart," James finished. "And the foundation launch with it." Grace's phone buzzed with a message from Robert Thompson. "Need to meet, now." "Go," Rebecca said. "James and I will start damage control here." When Grace arrived at the Thompson offices, she found Robert and Sarah waiting with grim faces. "Explain this," Robert said, pushing a newspaper across the desk. Grace took a deep breath. "It's a lie. Victoria and her brother stole millions from Maxwell Enterprises. We have proof, the real proof, not these doctored documents." "Can you prove that these are doctored?" Sarah asked. "Give me an hour with your forensic accountants," Grace replied. "I'll show them exactly how Victoria altered the numbers." Robert studied her for a moment. "You know, when Richard first told me about finding you on that park bench, I thought he was crazy. But now I understand what he saw in you. The same thing I see. Someone who refuses to back down when they know they're right." Grace spent the next 2 hours walking the Thompson accountants through the real documents, showing them how Victoria had manipulated the dates and amounts. When she returned to Maxwell Enterprises, she found Richard waiting in her office. "The Thompsons called," he said. "The deal is still on. In fact, they're increasing their investment again." He smiled. "You never cease to amaze me, Grace." "Richard," she said carefully, "there's something else you need to know. Your sister can tell me herself at dinner tonight." He interrupted. "Which reminds me," he seemed unusually nervous. "Would you like to have dinner with me? Just me, I mean, another night?" Grace's heart skipped a beat. She thought about what Rebecca had said, about the way Richard looked at her. "Richard, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I know it's complicated. I'm your boss, there's the age difference, and after Victoria, just think about it." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. After Richard left, she sat at her desk, her mind spinning. She picked up her phone to call Rebecca, then stopped. This was something she needed to figure out on her own. She opened her desk drawer and looked at Michael's photo. "What would you say about all this, honey?" she whispered. As if in answer, she remembered something Michael had told her just before his last deployment. "Life's too short to let fear stop you from being happy." Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from an unknown number. When she opened it, her blood ran cold. It was a photo of her and Richard at lunch last week, with the text, "Wonder what the board would think about the CEO dating a former homeless woman. Victoria sends her regards." Grace put down the phone, her hands shaking. Just when things were looking up, Victoria had found a new way to attack. But this time it wasn't just the company at stake, it was her heart. Grace stared at the threatening message from Victoria for a long time before making her decision. She wouldn't let fear rule her life, not again. She forwarded the message to Linda with a note. "Start a file. We might need this later." The dinner that evening was at Richard's penthouse. Grace had never been there before, and she felt a flutter of nervousness as the elevator doors opened. Rebecca greeted her with a warm hug. "You look worried," Rebecca whispered. "Did something happen?" Before Grace could answer, Richard walked in from the kitchen wearing an apron. "I hope everyone likes lasagna. It was Margaret's recipe." James emerged from the living room, tie loosened, looking unusually relaxed. "Dad's lasagna is the only thing he knows how to cook, but he does it well." The dinner started pleasantly enough, with Rebecca sharing funny stories about Richard's younger days. But when the conversation turned to business, the mood shifted. "I heard from David today," James said, putting down his fork. "He's offering to make all this go away if we sell him our healthcare division." Richard's face darkened. "Not going to happen." "There's more," Grace said quietly. She pulled out her phone and showed them Victoria's threatening message. Rebecca reached for Grace's hand. "Now you see why I came to you for help. They're trying to take everything, the company, the hospital, even your chance at happiness." "What hospital?" Richard asked sharply. Rebecca explained about David joining her hospital's board and the suspicious incidents. Richard's face grew stormer with each detail. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. "Because you would have rushed in trying to fix everything," Rebecca said. "Sometimes, big brother, you need to let others fight their own battles. Not when it comes to family," Richard insisted. "Grace is family now too," James surprised everyone by saying, "and they're using that against us." Grace felt warmth spread through her chest at James's words. How far they'd come from his initial suspicion of her. "I have an idea," she said slowly, "but it's risky. We need to let them think they're winning." Everyone leaned in as Grace outlined her plan. By the time she finished, even James was smiling. "It's crazy," he said, "but it might just work." Later, as they were clearing the dishes, Richard caught Grace alone in the kitchen. I've been thinking about what you said that day you returned my briefcase. About integrity being more valuable than money. Grace turned to face him. I meant it. I know. That's what scares Victoria and David the most about you. You can't be bought. He stepped closer. Grace, about that dinner. Yes, she said simply. Richard blinked. Yes? Yes, I'll have dinner with you. Just you. She smiled. Life's too short to let fear stop us from being happy. Richard's face lit up, making him look years younger. But before he could respond, James called from the living room. Dad, you need to see this. They hurried in to find everyone gathered. Around the TV, a breaking news story was showing footage of David being escorted out of Rebecca's hospital by security. Sources say board member David Richardson has been suspended pending an investigation into patient care violations, the reporter was saying. This comes after an anonymous tip revealed systematic attempts to deny treatment to veterans. Anonymous tip. Richard looked at Grace. She shrugged. I had Linda send some of our evidence to a friend at the newspaper. Thought it might help. Rebecca's situation. Rebecca hugged her. You're definitely family now. The next morning, Grace arrived at work to find flowers on her desk. Not expensive roses like Victoria used to favor, but simple daisies. The card read, Dinner tonight, R. But before she could smile, Linda rushed in. Grace, you need to see this email. It's from Veterans United's Board of Directors. Grace quickly read the email, her eyes widening. The board wanted to meet with her. They were claiming they had no knowledge of the fraud she had uncovered years ago, and they wanted her help to clean up the company. It's a trap, James said from the doorway. He walked in and sat down. They're trying to get you away from Maxwell Enterprises. Maybe, Grace said thoughtfully. Or maybe they're running scared. Think about it. David's been exposed. Victoria's reputation is ruined, and their stock price is dropping. They need to show they're changing. It's too dangerous, Richard said, joining them. After everything they did to you. That's exactly why I have to do this, Grace insisted. Not for revenge, but for all the families like mine who are still fighting for their benefits. Besides, she smiled at Richard, I'm not alone this time. James nodded slowly. She's right, Dad, and I want to help. I've been studying the veterans' healthcare industry since all this started. There are patterns of fraud we can expose. Richard looked at his son with pride. Margaret would love seeing you like this, fighting for what's right. Well, Rebecca said, walking in with coffee for everyone. Looks like we're taking on the whole corrupt system. Just another day at Maxwell Enterprises. They all laughed, but Grace felt a chill. Her phone had just buzzed with another message. From Victoria. You think you've won? Watch your back. Everyone has secrets and I've found yours. Grace looked around at her new family. Richard with his kind eyes, James with his newfound purpose, Rebecca with her fierce loyalty, and Linda hovering protectively nearby. Whatever secret Victoria thought she had found, Grace wasn't afraid. Some things were worth fighting for, and she had finally found hers. As if reading her thoughts, Richard reached for her hand. In front of everyone, he laced his fingers through hers. The gesture was simple but clear. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Outside the office windows, the city stretched out before them, full of challenges and possibilities. Grace thought about how far she had come from that park bench and how far she still had to go. But for the first time in years, the future didn't look scary. It looked exciting. Victoria's threat about Grace's secret haunted her as she prepared for her first official date with Richard. She had spent hours getting ready in her small apartment, finally settling on a simple blue dress she'd bought with her first Maxwell Enterprises paycheck. Her phone buzzed with a message from Linda. You need to come to the office, now. Grace's heart sank as she texted Richard to postpone their dinner. Something in Linda's message told her this couldn't wait. When she arrived at Maxwell Enterprises, she found Linda, James, and Rebecca waiting in her office. Their faces were grim. Victoria made her move, James said without preamble. He handed her a manila envelope. These were delivered to every board member this morning. Grace opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photographs, old ones, from her time at Veterans United. They showed her with Michael, but also with another man. They were holding hands, looking intimate. "His name was Peter Collins," Grace said quietly. "He worked with me at Veterans United. When Michael was deployed, Peter helped me uncover the fraud. We grew close, but nothing ever happened. I loved my husband. Victoria's." "Telling a different story," Linda said. "She's claiming you and Peter conspired to steal money from Veterans United, and when you got caught, you made up the fraud story as a cover." "That's ridiculous," Rebecca exclaimed. "Where's Richard? He needs to hear this from Grace directly." "He's in an emergency board meeting," James replied. "Victoria's brother called it. They're voting on whether to suspend Grace pending an investigation." Grace sat down heavily in her chair. "Peter died in a car accident 2 weeks after we exposed the fraud. I always suspected it wasn't really an accident, but I couldn't prove anything." "Did Dad know about any of this?" James asked. "No," Grace admitted. "I should have told him everything from the start, but I was afraid it would look exactly like this." Rebecca squeezed her shoulder. "We need to find proof that Victoria's lying. There must be something." "There is," Linda interrupted. Everyone turned to look at her. "I did some digging after Victoria's threat. Peter Collins didn't die in that car accident. He's alive, living under a new name in Arizona." Grace stood up so quickly her chair fell over. "What? But Veterans United said—" "They faked his death," Linda explained. "Gave him a new identity and a lot of money to disappear. But I found him, and I think it's time we brought him back. Just—" Then Richard burst into the office. His face was drawn with worry. "Grace, the board, they're asking for your resignation." "Richard, I can explain everything." "You don't have to," he said, surprising everyone. "I know about Peter Collins. I've known since the day you returned my briefcase." "How?" "Because I was on Veterans United's board back then. I was the anonymous source that helped you expose the fraud. I couldn't stand what they were doing to veterans' families, but I was too afraid to speak up publicly. You and Peter gave me the courage to do what was right." Grace stared at him, stunned. "Why didn't you tell me?" "For the same reason you didn't tell me. I was afraid. Afraid you'd think less of me for not doing more." He took her hand. "But I'm not afraid anymore. Victoria and David think they can use our past to tear us apart. Instead, it's brought us full circle." James cleared his throat. "This is all very touching, but we have about 20 minutes before the board votes. What's the plan?" Grace straightened her shoulders. "Linda, can you get Peter on the phone?" "Already done," Linda said, holding up her cell phone. "He's waiting to talk to you." The next 15 minutes were a blur of activity. While Grace talked to Peter, Richard and James prepared for the board meeting. Rebecca made some calls to her hospital's board members, building support. When they walked into the boardroom, Victoria was already there, looking triumphant. Her brother David stood beside her, smirking. "Well, well," Victoria said. "Come to clean out your office, Grace?" "Actually," Grace replied calmly, "I came to introduce someone." She nodded to Linda, who opened the boardroom door. A man walked in, older, grayer, but unmistakably Peter Collins. Victoria's face went white. "Hello, Victoria," Peter said. "Or should I call you by your real name, Emily Watson? You were the accounting clerk who helped cover up the fraud at Veterans United. I always wondered what happened to you." The boardroom erupted in chaos. David tried to leave, but found James blocking the door. Victoria started to speak, but Peter held up his hand. "I have copies of all the original documents," he said, "including the ones showing how you and your brother have been running this same scam at hospitals across the country, stealing from veterans just like before." Richard addressed the board. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have a choice to make. You can believe Victoria's lies, or you can look at the real evidence. Grace Williams didn't steal from Veterans United. She and Peter risked everything to expose the truth, just like she did here when she found Victoria stealing from Maxwell Enterprises. You're choosing her over your own wife?" Victoria screamed at Richard. "Ex-wife," Richard corrected. "And yes, I'm choosing integrity over deception, love over greed, the same choice I should have made years ago at Veterans United." The board's vote was unanimous. Victoria and David were escorted out of the building by security, this time for good. Peter agreed to testify about their years of fraud. and Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even known she was carrying. Later that evening, as they finally had their dinner date in Richard's penthouse, Grace asked the question that had been bothering her. "Why did you really hire me that day in the park? Was it because you knew who I was?" Richard smiled, taking her hand across the table. "I hired you because when I saw you sitting there with my briefcase, I saw someone who had lost everything but hadn't lost herself. Just like I saw today in the boardroom. We make quite a team," Grace said softly. "Yes, we do." Richard's eyes were warm as he looked at her, and I think Margaret would approve. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed. Grace thought about all the twists and turns that had led her here, from park bench to penthouse, from loss to love. But the story wasn't over yet. There was still one more chapter to write. 1 year had passed since the dramatic boardroom showdown with Victoria and David. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Grace's office at Maxwell Enterprises, catching the small diamond on her left hand and making it sparkle. "Still not used to wearing it?" Linda asked, bringing in the morning reports. Grace smiled, touching the engagement ring. "Sometimes it feels like I'm dreaming, like I'll wake up back on that park bench." "Well, this is definitely not a dream," Linda said, handing her a newspaper. The headline read, "Victoria Richardson and brother sentenced in veterans' healthcare fraud case." The trial had lasted 6 months, with Peter Collins as the star witness. In the end, Victoria and David's entire network of healthcare fraud had been exposed, leading to reforms across the industry. "Grace?" James appeared in the doorway, looking more relaxed and confident than she'd ever seen him. Running the company's veterans' healthcare division had given him a purpose he'd never had before. "The foundation board is waiting." The Margaret Maxwell Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. They'd helped hundreds of veterans' families get the care they needed, and their model was being copied by other companies across the country. "Coming." Grace gathered her papers. "Is your father back from Washington?" "Just landed. He'll meet us at the foundation." James grinned. "Try to act surprised when you see him." Grace knew Richard had been in D.C. testifying about healthcare reform, but something in James's smile told her there was more to it. The foundation offices occupied the entire 5th floor of Maxwell Enterprises. When Grace walked into the boardroom, she stopped short. Not only was Richard there, but so were Robert and Sarah Thompson, Rebecca and Michael's parents, Grace whispered. The elderly couple she hadn't seen since Michael's funeral stepped forward. Helen Williams had tears in her eyes as she hugged Grace. "Richard found us," she explained, "told us everything you've done. So, honey, Michael would be so proud." Richard stood up, looking nervous but happy. "Grace, there's something I need to ask you." "Well, several things, actually." He nodded to James, who pressed a button. On the large screen, a live video feed appeared, showing dozens of veterans' hospitals across the country. "The government has agreed to implement our healthcare reform model nationwide," Richard announced. "Every veterans' hospital will have a Margaret Maxwell Foundation office overseeing care and preventing fraud." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Richard, but that's not all," he continued. "The board has voted to create a new position, Executive Director of Veterans Affairs, and they want you to fill it." "Me, but what about my foundation work?" "You'll oversee both," James said. "Mom always said change had to come from both inside and outside the system." Richard took Grace's hands in his. "Which brings me to my last question. One I've been wanting to ask for a while now." He got down on one knee, and even though Grace was already wearing the ring, her heart skipped a beat. "A year ago, you were sitting on a park bench with my briefcase, and you changed my life. You showed me that true wealth isn't about money. It's about integrity, compassion, and love." He squeezed her hands. "We've dated, gotten engaged, and built something beautiful together, but I want to make it official in front of everyone we love. Grace Williams, will you marry me?" "Yes," Grace whispered, then louder, "Yes." The room erupted in applause, and on the video screens, cheers could be heard from hospitals across the country. Later that evening, Grace and Richard stood in their penthouse, looking out over the city. The Margaret Maxwell Foundation's new national headquarters would be visible from their window once construction was finished. "Penny for your thoughts?" Richard asked, wrapping his arms around her. "I was thinking about that morning, when you left your briefcase in the car. If you hadn't done that, we would have found each other some other way," Richard said confidently. "Some things are meant to be." Grace turned to face him. "You know Victoria's being released next year. And when she gets out, she'll find that everything has changed. The industry she tried to corrupt is being reformed. The company she tried to steal is stronger than ever." He touched her cheek. "And the woman she tried to destroy is about to become its new executive director." "And your wife," Grace added softly. "And my wife," Richard agreed. "Speaking of which, James and Rebecca are coming over with the wedding plans. They're arguing about whether we should get married in the garden where Margaret and I did, or the park," Grace said suddenly. "Let's get married in the park near that bench. Turn the place where our story began into the place where a new chapter starts." Richard's face lit up. "Perfect. Just like you." From somewhere in the city, church bells began to ring. Grace thought about all the turns her life had taken: the loss of Michael, the fight at Veterans United, the years of struggle, and then that fateful morning with the briefcase. "You know what Michael would say about all this?" she asked. Richard shook his head. He'd say sometimes the longest way around is the shortest way home. The elevator dinged, announcing James and Rebecca's arrival with their wedding plans. Soon the penthouse would be full of family, laughter, and love. Everything Grace had thought she'd lost forever. As she went to greet them, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She saw not just Grace Williams, the woman who had lost everything, or Grace Williams, the future executive director, but Grace Williams, the woman who had found her way home by choosing to do what was right, no matter the cost. And in the end, that had made all the difference. A week later, Grace stood in Central Park, surrounded by flowers and friends. She wore a simple white dress, and Richard waited for her near the bench where their story had begun. James stood beside his father as best man, while Rebecca was Grace's matron of honor. Linda sat with Michael's parents in the front row. Peter Collins was there too, healthy and happy in his real identity again. Even Robert and Sarah Thompson had come, along with most of the board members who had once doubted her. As Grace walked toward her future, she caught a glimpse of Richard's face. The same look of wonder he'd had that morning when she returned his briefcase. She smiled, thinking about how life's greatest treasures often come disguised as its greatest challenges. The minister began to speak, but Grace was looking at the bench, remembering. From homeless to head of a national foundation, from lost to loved, from alone to surrounded by family. It hadn't been an easy journey, but then again the most important ones never are. "Ready?" Richard whispered as she reached him. Grace squeezed his hand. "Ready?" Above them, the morning sun shone down on the park, on the bench, on the gathered family and friends, on second chances and new beginnings. And somewhere, Grace was sure Margaret was smiling.